October 14th, 1984, Paramount Studios, Stage 7. The young actor had been running his mouth for 3 weeks, calling Clint Eastwood a has-been cowboy loud enough for the whole crew to hear. That afternoon, the kid made one mistake. He disrespected Steve McQueen's memory. 47 witnesses watched Clint walk across that soundstage. They saw him grab the actor by the collar. Saved something extra special for you.
The kid never acted disrespectful again. In fact, he never acted again at all. Some said Clint destroyed him with words. Others whispered something darker happened that day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched like a taut wire across Stage 7, broken only by the hum of overhead lights and the distant rumble of traffic on Melrose. Clint's weathered hands still trembled as he released the kid's collar, watching 22-year-old Derek Sullivan stumble backward into a lighting rig. The boy's face had drained of color, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning fog over Malibu. "Pack your things," Clint said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had commanded respect on dozens of sets over 3 decades. "You're done here." Sullivan's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Around them, 47 crew members stood frozen, grips clutching cables, camera operators half hidden behind their equipment, script supervisors with pens suspended over their clipboards. Even the craft services table had gone quiet, coffee cooling in styrofoam cups. "You can't," Sullivan started, then stopped. Whatever Clint had whispered had clearly rewritten the rules of engagement. The kid's eyes darted around the soundstage, seeking allies who were suddenly very interested in checking their equipment. Clint turned away, dismissing him with the kind of casual indifference usually reserved for burned-out bulbs. "Tony, reset for scene 12. We'll pick up with Marcus for the close-ups." Tony Benedetti, the assistant director, blinked twice before finding his voice. Sure thing, Clint. Marcus is already in makeup." He glanced nervously at Sullivan, who stood rooted to the spot. "Should I call the studio about replacement?" "Already handled." Clint adjusted his worn Levi's jacket, the same one he'd worn on the set Oftomhorn 5 years ago, the same one Steve had borrowed the night before everything went to hell. "Let's move, people. We're burning daylight." The crew scattered like startled birds, everyone suddenly urgent about tasks that could have waited. But Clint caught the sideways glances, the whispered conversations behind equipment cases. He'd seen that look before, the mixture of respect and fear that followed a man who'd crossed certain lines. Sullivan finally found his legs, backing toward the stage door with jerky, uncoordinated movements. "This isn't over, Eastwood. You think you can intimidate. My father knows people. Your father," Clint said without turning around, "should have taught you when to shut your mouth." The heavy soundstage door slammed with a finality that seemed to echo in everyone's chest. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but the easy camaraderie of the morning shoot had evaporated. Clint could feel the weight of 47 pairs of eyes, each carrying the same unspoken question. What exactly did you tell him? The answer was simple enough. 3 words that connected to a night 15 years ago when friendship meant more than truth, and silence became a form of survival. Steve would understand. But Steve was gone, taking his absolution with him into the California earth. All that remained was the promise, spoken over a hospital bed that smelled of disinfectant and impending loss, to protect what mattered, even from punks like Derek Sullivan who thought Hollywood history was just another prop to kick around. "Places, everyone," Tony called out, his voice slightly higher than usual. "Clint, we're ready when you are." Clint nodded, settling into the director's chair that had his name stenciled on the back in faded white letters. The weight of it felt different today, heavier somehow. Through the viewfinder, he watched Marcus Williams, Sullivan's replacement, deliver lines with the kind of natural timing that couldn't be taught. The kid had talent, unlike the entitled brat who'd just learned that some doors, once slammed, never opened again. But as the cameras rolled and the familiar rhythm of filmmaking resumed, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Sullivan's eyes, in those final moments, had held more than just fear. There'd been calculation there, the look of someone already planning their next move. The problem with secrets was they never stayed buried as deep as you thought. especially in a town built on gossip, where information was currency and everyone was looking for their next big score. Steve had understood that better than anyone, understood that some stories were too dangerous to tell, even when the truth burned like acid in your gut. 3 crew members had died that night in November of '79, an equipment malfunction according to the official report. Faulty rigging that sent 1,000 pounds of lighting equipment crashing down during what should have been a routine night shoot. Only 2 people knew it wasn't an accident. Now only 1 remained to carry that weight. Clint called cut and watched the crew reset for another take. Professional, efficient. But underneath the surface he could feel the tremors of change beginning. Sullivan would go home, lick his wounds, and eventually someone would ask him what exactly had happened on Stage 7. When that day came, Clint would be ready. After all, Steve McQueen's best friend had learned a thing or two about survival. The rap bell echoed through Stage 7 at 6:30, its metallic chime signaling the end of another day in a career that had spanned more sunsets than Clint cared to count. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, coiling cables and striking lights with the fluid choreography of people who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. But tonight, conversations died when he passed, replaced by the kind of respectful distance usually reserved for funeral parlors. Clint gathered his notes from the director's chair, each page covered in the tight, economical handwriting Steve had always teased him about. Christ, Eastwood, you write like you're rationing ink. The memory hit him sideways, as they always did, unexpected and sharp enough to make his breath catch. 15 years, and Steve's voice still carried the weight of absolute authority in his head. The drive home to Carmel took him north on the Pacific Coast Highway, windows down despite the October chill. The ocean stretched endless and gray to his left, matching the color of the sky that pressed down like a heavy blanket. This was the time of day when the ghosts got restless, when the space between what was and what might have been grew thin enough to slip through. His house sat on 17 acres of oak and madrone, far enough from the neighbors that a man could think without interruption. Clint had bought it in '81, 2 years after Steve's diagnosis, when the weight of keeping secrets had grown heavier than the mortgage payments. The isolation wasn't accidental. Some conversations required absolute privacy, and some silences needed room to breathe. The German shepherd met him at the gate, tail wagging with the kind of uncomplicated joy that humans lost somewhere around adolescence. "Hey there, Duke." Clint scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the familiar comfort of an affection that asked no questions and expected no explanations. Steve had named him during one of their last visits, when the cancer had stolen his voice but left his sense of humor intact. Inside, the house carried the comfortable weight of a life lived deliberately. Books lined the walls, film theory mixed with Louis L'Amour westerns and dog-eared copies of variety that chronicled an industry's evolution. Photos scattered across the mantelpiece told the story of 3 decades in Hollywood, Clint with Sergio Leone on a dusty Spanish hillside, laughing with Meryl Streep between takes, and there, in the center, the one that mattered most. Steve at 35, leaning against his Mustang during a break in filming Bullet, that crooked grin that made women forget their own names and made studio executives reach for their checkbooks. The photo was signed in Steve's distinctive scrawl, "To Clint, the only guy in Hollywood who tells the truth. Don't change, you bastard." The irony burned fresh every time he looked at it. Clint poured 3 fingers of bourbon, Maker's Mark, the same brand they'd shared the night before Steve's final surgery, and settled into his leather chair. The house creaked around him with the gentle protests of aging wood, a sound that reminded him of film sets after the camera stopped rolling and the magic dissolved into ordinary exhaustion. Duke patted over and rested his massive head on Clint's knee, brown eyes reflecting the lamplight with ancient patience. These quiet moments had become his sanctuary, the only time when the careful mask he wore for the world could slip without consequence. But tonight, even here in his fortress of solitude, Derek Sullivan's calculating stare lingered like smoke from a distant fire. The kid would talk. They always did, eventually. Hollywood ran on currency more valuable than money. Information, scandal, the kind of behind-the-scenes drama that fed an industry built on manufactured dreams. Sullivan had tasted blood today, felt the sharp edge of real power, and that was a drug few people could resist. Clint's fingers found the scar on his left palm, a thin white line from a piece of shattered glass that had cut him the night everything changed. November 15, 1979. The date lived in his memory with the precision of an execution, every detail preserved in amber, the smell of burned electrical equipment, the screams that came too late, and Steve's face in the emergency room, understanding everything without a single word being spoken. We take this to our graves, Clint, all of it. The families don't need to know how it really happened. But graves, Clint had learned, were poor keepers of secrets, especially when the living carried them like splinters in their hearts, working deeper with each passing year until they threatened to break through skin. The bourbon burned warm in his chest as he raised the glass toward the photograph. Still keeping your secrets, partner. But that Sullivan kid, he's going to be trouble. Steve's paper grin offered no absolution, only the weight of promises made in hospital rooms that smelled of death and disinfectant. Outside, fog rolled in from the Pacific, wrapping the house in gray silence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new scenes to direct, new lies to maintain. But tonight, in the space between memory and obligation, Clint Eastwood sat alone with his ghosts and wondered how much longer even the strongest man could carry the weight of the dead. The phone's shrill ring cut through the fog-wrapped silence at 2:17 a.m., jarring Clint from dreams of burning electrical equipment and Steve's dying whisper. Duke lifted his head from the rug, ears pricked, while Clint stared at the old rotary phone on his nightstand, the same black bakelite model that had delivered the call about Steve's diagnosis 15 years ago. 3 rings. 4. The sound echoed through the house like a funeral bell. Eastwood. Static crackled across the line, followed by the distant hum of long-distance connection. Then a voice he hadn't heard in over a decade, gravelly, cigarette-scarred, unmistakably alive. "Hello, Clint. It's been a long time." The bourbon glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Duke scrambled to his feet as amber liquid spread across the boards like spilled blood. "Frank Pellicano." Clint's voice came out steadier than he felt. "I thought you were dead." A laugh, dry as desert wind, empty as a stripped film canister. "Disappointed? I've been in Mexico for the past 12 years. Lovely beaches, terrible cell service. But things change, don't they? Old debts come due." Clint's free hand found the scar on his palm, pressing until pain sharpened his focus. Frank Pellicano had been the lighting coordinator on Steve's last film, the third man who knew what really happened on November 15, 1979. The man they'd left for dead in the wreckage of Stage 9. "What do you want, Frank?" "Just catching up with an old friend. I heard through the grapevine that you had some trouble today. Young actor named Sullivan? Word is you scared him pretty good." The voice carried that familiar edge of calculation that had made Frank dangerous even when he was supposedly on their side. Funny thing about scared young actors, they tend to run their mouths. Start asking questions about old accidents. Through the window, fog pressed against the glass like ghostly fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn moaned its lonely warning. Sullivan doesn't know anything. Maybe not yet. But he's got connections, that boy. His daddy runs a private investigation firm, specializes in Hollywood dirt. Amazing what people will pay for the right kind of story. Frank's breathing rasped through the connection, labored and wet. "You remember Mickey Torres? Little grip who got crushed under that lighting rig? His daughter's all grown up now. Works for LA Times. Very interested in unsolved mysteries." Clint closed his eyes, seeing Mickey's face in the emergency room. 23 years old, skull crushed, never waking up to meet the daughter born 3 months later. One of 3 casualties from what the official report called catastrophic equipment failure due to improper rigging protocols. The truth had been simpler and infinitely worse. "Steve's dead, Frank. Whatever grudge you're nursing, leave him out of it." "Steve?" Frank's laugh turned into a coughing fit that lasted 30 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice carried the wet rattle of damaged lungs. "Steve's the reason I spent 12 years eating beans in Puerto Vallarta. Steve's the reason my wife divorced me and my kids think I'm dead. But Steve's also the reason I kept my mouth shut, had too much respect for the man to destroy his legacy." A pause, filled with the electronic hiss of distance and time. But Steve's been gone a long while now, hasn't he? And respect, well, respect doesn't pay for the cancer treatments I've been putting off. The words hit Clint like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window where fog had reduced the world to a gray void. Behind the glass, his reflection looked older than his 54 years, lined and weathered like a man who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. How much? Now that's the Clint Eastwood I remember, straight to business. But this isn't about money, partner. This is about truth, about those 3 families who never got to bury their people knowing what really happened, about a secret that's been eating you alive for 15 years. Clint's knuckles whitened against the phone. You were there, Frank. You know why we stayed quiet. I know what Steve told us. Protect the families, protect the industry, protect the lie. But Steve's not here anymore, is he? And that Sullivan kid, he's already started asking questions. About you, about that night, about why you whispered something in his ear that made him run like his ass was on fire. The fog seemed to press closer, reducing the world to this room, this moment, this voice from a past that refused to stay buried. 48 hours, Clint. Then I start making calls, maybe to Mickey's daughter at the Times, maybe to Bobby Henshaw's widow. She never did believe that accident report. Or maybe I'll just have a nice long chat with young Mr. Sullivan's private investigator father. The line went dead, leaving Clint alone with the dial tone's mechanical heartbeat and the weight of a promise that had just become a noose around his neck. The dial tone droned like a flatline monitor, mechanical and final. Clint held the phone against his ear for another 30 seconds, as if the connection might resurrect itself and reveal this whole conversation as some whiskey-fueled nightmare. But the black bakelight remained silent, offering nothing but the distant hum of a world that suddenly felt much smaller than it had at dinner. Duke whined softly, padding through the scattered glass to press his warm flank against Clint's leg. The simple gesture of loyalty, uncomplicated, unquestioning, nearly broke something fundamental in his chest. Even his dog trusted him more than he trusted himself right now. Clint set the phone down with exaggerated care and walked to the kitchen, boots crunching on bourbon-soaked glass. His hands moved through the familiar ritual of making coffee, muscle memory operating while his mind raced through scenarios, each one darker than the last. 3:30 a.m., the dead hour, when old sins came calling and the bills for buried secrets finally came due. Frank Pellicano, alive. The word tasted like copper pennies and broken promises. They'd left him in the wreckage of Stage 9, pinned under a beam that should have killed him instantly. Steve had checked for a pulse while Clint stood guard, watching for security. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The decision to leave him, to let the official investigators find his body with the others, had torn Steve apart. But there'd been no choice, no time, and certainly no way to explain what Frank had really been doing up in that lighting grid at 1:15 in the morning. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its cheerful burbling a mockery of the silence that had settled over the house like a burial shroud. Clint leaned against the counter, studying his reflection in the black window. 54 years old, and he looked every day of it tonight. The lines around his eyes had deepened into canyons, carved by 15 years of carrying weight that was never meant for one person. 48 hours. Frank's timeline felt deliberately chosen, long enough to let fear ferment, short enough to prevent any real countermeasures. By Thursday morning, Derek Sullivan's private investigator father would know exactly what questions to ask and which stones to turn over. Mickey Torres's daughter at the Times would have enough information to start pulling threads that connected to a story the industry had spent 15 years trying to forget. The coffee finished brewing with a decisive click. Clint poured a cup, black as crude oil, and settled at his kitchen table, the same scarred pine surface where he'd eaten breakfast with Steve the morning after the accident. They'd sat in silence mostly, both understanding that everything had changed, but neither willing to name the new reality that stretched ahead of them like a minefield. Some secrets, Steve had said finally, stirring sugar into coffee he wouldn't drink, are heavier than others. But that's what friendship means, helping each other carry what we can't bear alone. Noble words, the kind that sounded meaningful in grief's immediate aftermath, when the weight of what they'd done felt shared rather than singular. But Steve had escaped into death's honest silence, leaving Clint to navigate 15 years of careful lies and strategic omissions. Every interview, every film, every casual conversation about the old days had become a potential trap. Now Frank was back, risen from a Mexican grave like some biblical nightmare, demanding payment for silence that was never really his to sell. The cancer Frank mentioned, Clint could hear it in his voice, that wet rattle of tissue turning traitor. A dying man with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous adversary imaginable, especially one who'd spent 12 years nurturing grievances in foreign exile. Duke's tail thumped against the floor, responding to some sound Clint hadn't noticed, car doors slamming, footsteps on gravel. The digital clock on the microwave read 4:12 a.m., too early for deliveries, too late for casual visitors. Clint moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer into the fog-shrouded driveway. A black sedan sat behind his truck, government issue anonymous. Two figures stood beside it, their conversation lost in the gray silence but their body language unmistakably official. Too fast. Frank had said 48 hours, but someone was already moving pieces across a board Clint couldn't see. Either Frank was lying about his timeline, or other forces had been set in motion long before tonight's phone call. The doorbell's chime echoed through the house, followed immediately by 3 sharp knocks. Professional, insistent, the kind of knock that didn't wait for convenient answers. Clint checked his reflection in the hallway mirror, running fingers through sleep-mussed hair that had gone more gray than brown when he wasn't paying attention. Whatever came next, he'd face it looking like the man Steve McQueen had trusted with his final secret, even if that trust was about to destroy them both. The knocking came again, more insistent now. Duke growled low in his throat, positioning himself between Clint and the door with the loyalty of an animal who sensed his pack leader's fear. 48 hours had just become right now. Clint's hand rested on the deadbolt for a full 10 seconds, feeling the cold metal against his palm like the trigger of a gun he didn't want to fire. Through the peephole, the two figures stood with practiced patience, a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun, and a younger man whose cheap suit screamed federal government on a budget. The woman held up a leather wallet, badge catching the porch light. "Mr. Eastwood, Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. We need to speak with you about Frank Pelicano." Jesus. Clint stepped back from the door, mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same dark conclusion. Frank hadn't called to shake him down. He'd called to say goodbye. The feds already had him, which meant they'd had him for longer than 12 years of supposed Mexican exile. How long had Frank been talking? How much did they already know? "Mr. Eastwood?" The woman's voice carried the kind of professional courtesy that preceded handcuffs. "We understand this is early, but Mr. Pelicano has provided information regarding the November 15, 1979 incident at Paramount Studios. We'd prefer to discuss this privately rather than through attorneys." Duke's growl deepened, hackles rising as he sensed the shift in his master's energy. Clint's fingers found the scar on his palm, pressing until the old wound sent sharp signals up his arm. Pain to anchor him in the present instead of drowning in 15-year-old quicksand. He turned the deadbolt and opened the door 6 inches, security chain still engaged. It's 4 in the morning. Agent Chen's smile held all the warmth of an autopsy report. "Mr. Pelicano suffered a massive coronary episode 3 hours ago. He's in intensive care at Cedars-Sinai. Before he lost consciousness, he insisted we contact you immediately." She paused, letting that sink in. "He said you'd understand why time was critical." The security chain felt suddenly heavy in Clint's fingers. Frank was dying, really dying this time, and he'd used his last conscious moments to set events in motion that couldn't be stopped. It was the kind of final chess move that Steve would have appreciated for its brutal efficiency. "What exactly did he tell you?" Enough to know that the official report on the Stage 9 collapse was incomplete. The younger agent spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the eager edge of someone still building his career on other people's secrets. 3 people died that night: Mickey Torres, Bobby Henshaw, and Linda Kozlov. Mr. Pelicano was presumed dead but survived with severe injuries. Clint's memory supplied the details they didn't mention: Mickey's skull crushed under 1,000 pounds of lighting equipment, Bobby trapped beneath collapsed scaffolding, Linda electrocuted when the main power grid shorted. 3 deaths that had been ruled accidental, buried under insurance settlements and studio liability waivers. Presumed dead? Clint kept his voice level, but his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged animal. The man called me 2 hours ago. Doesn't sound very dead. Agent Chen's eyes sharpened with the focus of a predator scenting blood. Yes, he mentioned that conversation. Said he'd given you 48 hours to, quote, do the right thing. We're hoping you might clarify what he meant. Through the gap in the door, Clint could see the fog beginning to lift, revealing the dark shapes of oak trees that had stood sentinel over his property for decades. Those trees had been here when Hollywood was orange groves and broken dreams, and they'd be here long after the industry cannibalized itself into extinction. There was something comforting in that permanence, even as his own carefully constructed world cracked apart like old film stock. I haven't spoken to Frank Pellicano since 1979, Clint said finally. Whatever he told you, it's the ramblings of a sick man trying to settle old scores before he dies. Mr. Eastwood. Agent Chen's voice carried the patience of someone who'd heard every variation of denial in her 20-year career. We have recordings of tonight's phone conversation. We have bank records showing payments made to a Mexican account under Mr. Pellicano's assumed identity. We have witness statements from surviving crew members who heard heated arguments between you, Mr. McQueen, and Mr. Pellicano in the weeks before the incident. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. They hadn't just found Frank. They'd been building a case around his testimony for months, maybe years. The net was already tightened, the trap already sprung. All that remained was the final surrender. Duke pressed against his leg again, warm and solid and real in a world that suddenly felt constructed of lies and misdirection. The simple faith in those brown eyes reminded Clint of Steve's expression in the hospital, when the cancer had stolen everything except his absolute trust that Clint would carry their secret honorably. But honor, it turned out, was another word for the weight that eventually crushed strong men into powder. I need to call my lawyer, Clint said, and heard his own voice as if from a great distance, the sound of a man finally admitting that some promises were too heavy for any friendship to bear. Agent Chen nodded as if she'd expected exactly that response. Of course, but before you make that call, there's something else you should know. She glanced at her partner, some silent communication passing between them. Mr. Pellicano wasn't our only source. The security chain felt like ice against Clint's fingers. What do you mean? Steve McQueen contacted the Bureau 6 weeks before his death. He wanted to make a statement about the Stage 9 incident. The younger agent consulted his notebook. Though Clint sensed the gesture was theatrical, these details were burned into his memory. He never followed through. Died before we could arrange a formal interview. The world tilted sideways. Clint gripped the doorframe, feeling 15 years of carefully constructed reality crumble like old mortar. You're lying. Are we? Agent Chen's voice remained maddeningly calm. December 3rd, 1980. Steve called our Los Angeles field office from his hospital bed. Spoke to Agent William Morrison. He's retired now, but his notes are comprehensive. Quote, there are things about the Paramount accident that need to be told. People deserve the truth about how Mickey Torres and the others really died. No. The word screamed through Clint's skull, but his lips couldn't form it. Steve in that hospital bed, skeletal and gray, gripping Clint's hand with what little strength the cancer had left him. Promise me you'll keep the secret. Promise me you'll protect what we built. Those had been his exact words, spoken with the desperate intensity of a man facing judgment. But if Steve had called the FBI, he was dying, Clint heard himself say. Morphine, radiation treatments. He wasn't thinking clearly. Agent Chen's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been sympathy. Mr. Eastwood, we've been investigating this case for 3 years. We know about the payments to Frank Pellicano. We know about the cover-up. We know Steve McQueen was trying to clear his conscience before he died. She paused, letting the silence stretch like a tightening noose. What we don't know is why you've been carrying this alone for 15 years when your best friend was ready to tell the truth. The security chain snapped under Clint's grip, metal links scattering across the hardwood floor like fallen teeth. Duke yelped and scrambled backward, sensing his master's sudden explosion of movement. But Clint barely registered any of it, his mind reeling through memory after memory that now felt stained with deception. Steve's funeral, the weight of the coffin on his shoulder as they carried it up Forest Lawn's manicured slope, standing beside the grave afterward, making his promise to the freshly turned earth while Steve's widow Allie wept into a black handkerchief. Every word had been spoken in the absolute certainty that he was honoring his friend's final wish. But Steve had wanted to confess, had to confess, which meant, "You think I killed him to keep him quiet." The words came out flat, emotionless. "You think I murdered my best friend to protect a secret." Agent Chen stepped closer to the doorway, her eyes never leaving Clint's face. "Did you?" The question hung in the fog-shrouded air like an executioner's blade. Clint found himself remembering Steve's last day, the labored breathing, the skeletal fingers wrapped around a paper cup of ice chips, the way his eyes had tracked Clint's movement around the hospital room with something that might have been fear. At the time, Clint had attributed it to pain medication and approaching death. But now, Steve died of lung cancer. His voice sounded hollow even to himself. Mesothelioma from asbestos exposure on film sets. There were 50 witnesses, medical records, autopsy reports. Yes, Agent Chen agreed. Very thorough documentation. Almost too thorough for a man who supposedly died peacefully in his sleep. She consulted her own notebook, especially when the attending nurse reported that Steve's last words were, "Clint knows what really happened." She assumed he was delirious. The fog pressed against the windows like ghostly accusations, reducing the world to this doorway, this moment, this terrible revelation that recontextualized 15 years of grief and guilt. Clint had been carrying Steve's secret as a sacred trust, a final act of friendship that transcended death itself. But Steve hadn't wanted the secret kept. He'd wanted it exposed, which meant every careful lie, every strategic omission, every sleepless night spent guarding the truth had been a betrayal of everything Steve actually stood for. "He was my friend," Clint whispered, and the words felt like eulogy for something that had died long before Steve drew his last breath. Agent Chen's expression softened fractionally. "Then help us understand what really happened on Stage 9. Help us give Mickey Torres's daughter the answers she's been looking for. Help us honor what Steve McQueen actually wanted instead of what you thought he wanted." The morning light was growing stronger, burning through the fog to reveal a landscape that looked exactly the same but felt completely foreign. Clint stared at the two federal agents and realized that the enemy he'd been fighting for 15 years had been his own misguided loyalty. Clint stepped back from the doorway, the broken chain links crunching under his feet like shattered bone. The federal agents remained motionless on his porch, patient as vultures waiting for something to finish dying. Behind them, the fog continued its retreat, revealing a world that looked deceptively normal, as if the last hour hadn't rewritten 15 years of carefully constructed lies. "Come in," he said finally, his voice barely recognizable. "You want the truth? Then you're going to get all of it." Agent Chen exchanged another look with her partner before stepping across the threshold. Duke retreated to his bed in the corner, yellow eyes tracking the strangers with the wariness of an animal who sensed his pack leader's surrender. The house felt smaller with federal agents in it, as if their presence had compressed the walls inward. Clint led them to the kitchen, gesturing toward chairs at the scarred pine table. The coffee still sat in its pot, bitter and cooling, but he poured 3 cups anyway. His hands remained steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. 15 years of practiced composure dying hard. "Before we start," Agent Chen said, setting down her untouched coffee, "I need to be clear about something. This conversation is being recorded. You have the right to legal counsel. But if you're finally ready to honor what Steve McQueen actually wanted..." Steve didn't know what he wanted. The words erupted from somewhere deep in Clint's chest, carrying venom that surprised even him. Steve was a coward who got 3 people killed and then spent his last months trying to find someone else to blame. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to collapse the ceiling. Agent Chen's pen had stopped moving across her notebook. Her partner leaned forward slightly, sensing blood in the water. Clint pressed his palm against the table's surface, feeling the wood grain beneath his fingers. Real, solid, unchanged by confession or catastrophe. You want to know what really happened on stage 9? Steve McQueen happened. Steve and his goddamn pride and his absolute certainty that rules didn't apply to movie stars. The memories came flooding back with the force of a dam break. November 15th, 1979. They'd been shooting night scenes for Hunter, Steve's last film, though none of them knew it then. The lighting grid above stage 9 had been giving problems all week. Union electricians complaining about outdated equipment, safety inspectors writing violation notices that disappeared into studio bureaucracy. Frank Pellicano was head electrician on the film, Clint continued, his voice gaining momentum like a confession 15 years in the making. Good man. Old school. He'd worked with Steve on Bullet and The Great Escape. But Frank had rules about safety protocols. And Steve thought rules were suggestions. Agent Chen's pen resumed its scratching across paper, capturing words that would finally give Mickey Torres's daughter the answers she'd been seeking. Clint wondered if those answers would feel like justice or just another kind of wound. Steve wanted to do his own stunt work, always did. But this particular scene required him to be suspended 40 feet above the stage floor while explosions went off around him. Frank refused to rig the equipment without proper safety inspections. Said the grid couldn't handle the additional weight load. The younger agent spoke up. So what happened? Clint's coffee had gone cold, but he drank it anyway, needing the bitter taste to anchor him in the present. Steve went around him, found some non-union guys who were willing to work for cash, set up the rigging himself while Frank was at dinner, figured he'd prove the old man wrong, show him that movie magic trumped engineering degrees. Through the kitchen window, full morning light was revealing his property in sharp detail. The oak trees, the gravel driveway, the ordinary domestic landscape of a man who'd spent 15 years pretending to be someone else. By evening, news vans would probably be parked where federal sedans now sat. His carefully guarded privacy would become just another casualty of truth. Frank came back and found Steve hanging from jury-rigged cables that had been bolted into grid supports never designed for that kind of stress. He went up to disconnect the rig before someone got killed, brought Mickey Torres and the others with him because it was a 3-man job minimum. Agent Chen looked up from her notebook. And that's when the grid collapsed. That's when Steve decided to do the stunt anyway. Clint's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. 40 feet up, Frank screaming at him to abort, and Steve triggers the explosion sequence. The concussion wave hit the already compromised supports and brought down half the lighting grid. The kitchen felt too small suddenly, as if the walls were pressing inward under the weight of confession. Duke whined softly from his corner, sensing distress he couldn't understand or comfort. 4 people fell, Clint said. Frank survived because he landed on Mickey Torres's body. The others weren't so lucky. Agent Chen set down her pen with deliberate precision. And Steve McQueen's response? Clint met her eyes directly, letting her see the 15 years of poison that confession was finally draining from his system. Steve's response was to make me help him frame Frank Pellicano for sabotage. The words hung in the kitchen air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Agent Chen's pen had stopped moving entirely now, her eyes fixed on Clint's face with the intensity of someone watching a man finally step off a cliff he'd been circling for 15 years. Frame him how? Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd heard confessions that could topple governments. But Clint caught the slight tremor underneath. The morning light streaming through his kitchen windows felt harsh now, exposing every line on his weathered face, every shadow under his eyes, every detail of a man who'd been slowly poisoning himself with another man's secrets. Duke whined again from his corner, pressing his massive head against his paws as if trying to shut out words that would change everything. Steve was bleeding internally from the fall, 3 broken ribs, punctured lung, but he was conscious enough to think, and thinking was always Steve's strongest and most dangerous trait. Clint's fingers found the coffee mug again, gripping it like an anchor. While the paramedics were working on the others, Steve grabbed my shirt and pulled me close, whispered that we had to make this Frank's fault or his career would be over. Agent Chen's partner leaned forward. His career was more important than 3 lives? You have to understand, Steve. The words came out sharper than Clint intended, carrying 15 years of buried resentment. He wasn't evil, he was terrified. Paramount had invested $40 million in the hunter. If word got out that he'd ignored safety protocols and killed crew members with his recklessness, he'd never work again. Every studio in town would blacklist him. The silence stretched long enough for Clint to hear the distant hum of morning traffic, the ordinary world going about its business, while he finally dismantled the lies that had defined half his adult life. He wondered if confession was supposed to feel this hollow, this empty of relief. So we planted evidence. The words tasted like copper pennies, like blood from a bitten tongue. Steve had connections everywhere: studio security, LAPD investigators, insurance adjusters. While Frank was in surgery, we went through his toolbox and sabotaged his equipment, made it look like faulty wiring had caused the grid collapse. Agent Chen's voice remained steady, professional. And Frank Pelicano's response when he recovered? Frank knew exactly what we'd done. Clint's laugh held no humor, just the bitter recognition of how completely they'd underestimated a man whose crime had been caring about safety. He was old school, but he wasn't stupid. The evidence was too clean, too convenient. But by then the studio had already made their insurance claim, the LAPD had closed the case, and the families had settled their wrongful death suits. The kitchen felt like a confessional booth now, intimate and suffocating. Clint found himself remembering Frank's face in the hospital, the way his eyes had tracked Clint's movement around his bed, the careful distance he'd maintained even while accepting their blood money. Frank had known he was being bought, but he'd also known that 3 people were already dead, and revenge wouldn't resurrect them. The payments to Mexico, Agent Chen said, consulting her notebook. How long did they continue? 15 years, every month, like clockwork. Frank took our money and disappeared. Steve convinced himself that proved Frank's guilt. An innocent man wouldn't have taken hush money. Clint's voice cracked slightly. I knew better. Frank took the money because we'd destroyed his reputation and his life. It was compensation, not extortion. The younger agent spoke up again. But Steve McQueen tried to contact the FBI before his death. That suggests he'd changed his mind about the cover-up. Clint closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the final betrayal pressing against his chest like a collapsed building. Steve got religion when the cancer spread to his brain. Started talking about Judgment Day, about making peace with his victims. I thought it was delirium, the morphine, the radiation treatments. He kept asking me to promise I'd keep our secret, so I promised, but he was actually asking you to help him reveal it. Agent Chen's voice carried something that might have been sympathy. I was so focused on protecting his legacy that I never heard what he was actually saying. The confession felt like bleeding out, each word draining something vital from his system. Steve died thinking I'd help him tell the truth. Instead, I spent 15 years making sure the truth stayed buried. Through the kitchen window, Clint could see his neighbors going about their morning routines, walking dogs, collecting newspapers, loading children into minivans. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of secrets that could destroy careers and reputations. He envied them with an intensity that surprised him. Frank called me 2 nights ago, he said finally. Told me he was dying and that he'd already contacted you. Gave me 48 hours to confess voluntarily. Clint met Agent Chen's eyes directly. He was offering me the chance to finally honor Steve's actual wishes, instead of the ones I'd imagined. The silence that followed felt different now, not empty, but full of possibility. The truth was finally free, spreading through the morning air like sunlight burning away fog. Agent Chen closed her notebook with the soft finality of a coffin lid. The kitchen fell into silence except for Duke's rhythmic breathing and the distant hum of morning traffic, ordinary sounds from a world that felt fundamentally different now that the truth had been spoken aloud. We'll need you to come in and make an official statement, she said, rising from the scarred pine table. There will be paperwork, depositions, probably a grand jury. The families deserve their day in court, even after all these years. Clint nodded, feeling lighter and infinitely heavier at the same time. What happens to Steve's reputation? That's not our concern, Agent Chen replied, but her voice carried an unexpected gentleness. Our job is justice for Mickey Torres and the others. What Hollywood does with the information is up to them. After the agents left, Clint sat alone at his kitchen table watching the last of the fog burn away. The morning light revealed his property in stark detail, every fallen leaf, every imperfection in the gravel driveway, every ordinary detail of a life that would never be ordinary again. By evening, the news vans would arrive. By tomorrow, Steve McQueen's name would be dragged through headlines that would rewrite film history. He found himself thinking about the young actor whose disrespect had triggered this avalanche. Tyler Morrison, cocky and ambitious, dismissive of washed-up Hollywood trash. The kid had no idea that his casual cruelty had finally freed 3 families from 15 years of lies. Sometimes the most important changes came from the most trivial catalysts. Duke padded over and rested his massive head on Clint's lap, sensing distress he couldn't understand but could comfort. Clint scratched behind the dog's ears, grateful for simple affection that asked no questions and demanded no explanations. The phone rang 6 times over the next hour. Entertainment reporters, studio executives, old colleagues who'd somehow already heard whispers. Clint let them all go to the machine, their urgent voices echoing through his house like ghosts demanding answers. Tomorrow he would face the cameras and the questions and the inevitable destruction of everything he'd built on Steve McQueen's grave. But today, he sat in his kitchen and felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years: peace. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent a decade and a half protecting a legacy that his best friend had wanted to destroy. Every sleepless night, every careful lie, every strategic omission had been a betrayal disguised as loyalty. Steve had died believing that Clint would help him find redemption, and instead, Clint had wrapped himself in martyrdom that honored no one. But Frank Pellicano, dying of lung cancer in a Tijuana hospice, had finally offered him the chance to honor what Steve McQueen actually stood for, instead of what Clint had imagined he represented. The truth. Justice for working men who deserved better than to die for a movie star's vanity. Peace for families who'd buried their loved ones without ever understanding why. As afternoon light slanted through his windows, Clint pulled out his laptop and began typing. If the world was going to learn about Steve McQueen's final secret, they should hear it from someone who'd loved him enough to carry his guilt for 15 years. Someone who understood that true friendship sometimes meant destroying the very thing you died to protect. The words came slowly at first, then faster as muscle memory took over. He wrote about Stage 9 and the lighting grid that had never been designed for Steve's ambitions, about Mickey Torres and the others who'd died because safety protocols were inconvenient obstacles to cinematic vision, about Frank Pellicano, who'd taken their blood money not from greed but from necessity, whose only crime had been caring more about human lives than movie magic. Most importantly, he wrote about Steve McQueen in his final days, not the rebel icon who'd defined American cool, but a dying man desperate to make peace with his victims, a man who'd asked his best friend for one last favor and been betrayed by misguided loyalty. When he finished, the sun was setting behind his oak trees, painting his kitchen in shades of gold that reminded him of those perfect moments on film sets before everything went wrong. He read through what he'd written, making small corrections, ensuring that every detail honored the truth that Steve had died wanting to tell. Tomorrow, Mickey Torres's daughter would finally understand why her father had fallen 40 feet to his death on a Hollywood soundstage. 3 families would have their answers. Frank Pellicano would live his remaining days knowing that justice had finally found its voice. And Clint Eastwood, weathered stunt coordinator turned director turned confessor, would face the cameras and tell the world that sometimes the most heroic thing a man can do is admit he's been wrong for 15 years. Duke settled beside his chair with a contented sigh, and Clint realized he was finally ready to sleep without Steve McQueen's ghost standing watch beside his bed.